One of the well-known stories from the Hebrew scriptures is that of David and Goliath. I'm guessing many of you remember it. Saul and the Israelites are facing an army of Philistines. The two encampments sit across from each other, and each morning, a giant of a man named Goliath comes out to the line and shouts defiantly at the Israelites, asking for a man to fight. Days upon days go by like this. And finally, a young man named David, who's been sent to bring supplies to his brothers who are in the army, asks around about the situation. He gets taken to Saul, and David offers to fight the giant Philistine. Saul scoffs, but David assures him that his experience tending the flock back home and fending off lions and bears makes him just the man for the job. Saul gives over his own armor and weaponry, but when David tries it on, it doesn't feel right. He declares he can't use it as he isn't used to it. And instead, he picks up his shepherd's staff, his sling, and he locates 5 smooth stones, which he puts in his pouch. And out he marches. The Philistine unsurprisingly laughs at David, but David invokes his Lord, runs toward Goliath, places 1 smooth stone in his sling and lets it fly. And he strikes Goliath right between the eyes, and down the giant falls. David is triumphant. The Philistine army disperses, and David is brought before Saul to receive accolades and gifts. The story, of course, gets told over and over, invoked time and time again as the quintessential underdog story. Against all odds, the young shepherd boy, unarmored, unarmed, fells the experienced warrior. The mythology is powerful, ancient, and a time-tested way of inspiring and creating hope. We Unitarian Universalists have at times cast ourselves as the underdog. We are a small denomination, 1,000 or thereabouts congregations across the United States and Canada, some sprinkled through the rest of the world. We understand ours as an uphill battle against the entrenched religions of history. And certainly we understand our path as one away from static religious thinking or stagnant religious community. This positioning makes sense. Historically, the ideas that inspired our 2 religious antecedents were heresies. In many centuries, the beliefs we inherit were punishable by death. The Unitarian view that God was singular, that the Trinity was not scriptural, that Jesus was not co-eternal with God, not even uniquely God's self. These were heresies disallowed from the time of the Council of Nicaea in 325. The Universalist view that God was too loving to ever condemn any creation to an eternity of torment, that universal salvation would be given to all people no matter what they had done. This too was a heresy disallowed from the early medieval period. Of course, it is worth noting that both were interpretive options available in the earliest days after Jesus's death. Only with institutionalization, with conformity and canonization did these alternative ways of understanding the life of Jesus, the nature of God, and cosmology become anathema. These heresies rose again in 19th century America with figures like William Ellery Channing, whose sermon, Unitarian Christianity, in 1819, defined for centuries what Unitarian meant. Channing established the use of reason in scriptural interpretation and religious thought, and from there he proclaimed God's unity, Jesus's full humanity, the goodness of God, and Jesus's life as one of moral example, not salvation. Then there was Hosea Ballou, who preached a doctrine of universal salvation centered around God's love, regardless of our human error, and whose work, Treatise on Atonement from 1805, centered human experience and the humanly driven nature of morality and immorality. In 1841, Theodore Parker delivered his foundational sermon, The Transient and the Permanent in Christianity. This sermon declared that in religion there is the eternal permanent truth that is God's, and the changing, transient truth that is humanity's. What was true, what was pure, what was moral, what was permanent, Parker argued, was loving humanity, loving God. The message of Jesus, of religion, was to cultivate salvation through love in our own hearts and thus change the world. These foundational theologians and preachers left a legacy that the 20th century took up. James Luther Adams wrote of what he called the 5 smooth stones of liberal religion, hearkening back to that David and Goliath story. These are the weapons, if we want to use that word, that we have in our liberal religious journey, said James Luther Adams. Adams was a parish minister, a professor, and a prolific author. A brief essay contained within the larger work on being human religiously encapsulates what is different about religious liberalism, what sets it apart from theologically, culturally, or behaviorally conformist notions of religion. The first stone, he writes, is that meaning has not been fully captured. What he means is what we often say here: nothing is finished, nothing is over. Put in other words, revelation is continuous. The result of this, though, is that everything can be critiqued, new information can always be incorporated, things are not complete. We are unfolding, existence is unfolding. We are growing and changing and journeying on. The second stone is that, quote, relations between persons ought ideally to rest on mutual, free consent and not on coercion. Loyalty and conviction should be freely given, not coerced, not forced. We're free to determine whether or not we want to walk alongside each other. We are free to determine what meaning to make out of the unfolding of our lives and this world. And we can covenant to make that meaning in each other's company. The third, that we are obligated morally to work, quote, toward the establishment of a just and loving community. This community we seek is human, exists in time and space, and it is an, quote, achievement of freedom with respect to material resources, as well as with respect to spiritual resources. It isn't enough to live by the Spirit, Adams wrote, one must do. It isn't enough to have faith in a world to come, one must make this world just and loving by our actions, our gifts, and our living. The fourth smooth stone, that organization makes possible the establishment of the loving community. Intentional, organized social behavior. He writes, quote, no one can properly put faith in merely individual virtue, even though that is a prerequisite for societal virtues. The faith of the liberal must express itself in societal forms. Without these, freedom and justice in community are impossible. Faith is only worthwhile, we can say, only good, adequate, he writes, if it leads one to give time and energy to changing politics, changing society, changing education. We must organize power, because it is through the human exercise of organized power that we actually accomplish change. The fifth stone, put simply, is optimism. The idea that available to all of us are resources. JLA, as he is affectionately known, says there are human and divine resources that justify seeing the universe unfolding in a positive way if we each do our part. It's not a blind optimism, he says, but maybe a willful optimism. He writes that, quote, with all the realism and tough-mindedness that can be mustered, the genuine liberal finally can hear and join in the Hallelujah chorus. Intellectual integrity, social relevance, amplitude of perspective, and the spirit of liberation offer no less. My colleague, the Reverend Tony Lorenzen, sums up the 5 smooth stones of James Luther Adams with one word for each. Reverend Lorenzen encapsulates them as evolution, freedom, justice, agency, and hope. When I consider these 5 smooth stones, these tools we carry in our quest for liberal religious freedom and for a changed world, when I think about those who came before and who laid the groundwork for this thing we share called Unitarian Universalism, I think about what I believe the 5 smooth stones to be now. We live in a different world than the mid-20th century one that James Luther Adams was writing in. And while some things are permanent, that baseline of love and unity that Channing, Ballou, and Parker wrote of, while some things are permanent, our reason and our forebears also teach us that the human experience changes. And the way that we speak about the ineffable, the way that we make meaning, the way that we live changes. JLA's first point is that revelation doesn't stop. And we have had revealed in the waning decades of the 20th century and these first 2 decades of the 21st century, some hard and very real truths. We have had revealed to us, though it came as no surprise to billions of people the world over, that racism and oppression are alive and well. We have had revealed to us, though it came as no surprise to billions of people the world over, that the human experience of identity and gender and sexuality is wildly vast. We have had revealed to us, though it came as no surprise to billions of people the world over, that our treatment of this earth is damaging the one home we know. We have had revealed to us, though it came as no surprise to billions of people the world over, that unchecked capitalism creates deeper and deeper economic divides. We have had revealed to us so much more about what this being human really is, what it means and what it offers. Revelation does not stop, and our response to revelation cannot stop if we are to remain relevant, if we are to outrun the past and the present with visions of the future. Our forebears were wise in their time, and much of their wisdom persists and will do so down generations. But we do not believe in static thought, stagnant belief, or stale modes of experiencing and seeking the truth. Ours is a living tradition, a living religion that asks us to grow and never take for granted any particular aspect of our humanity or our human experience. When I think about this call to growth, I think about the decades since JLA wrote his words that many of us hold so dear. Unitarian Universalism has gone through shifting alignments. At one point, identifying more strongly with humanism, eschewing language of reverence, and leaning more toward atheism and agnosticism. For some, that alignment may have felt like the culmination of the evolution of Unitarian Universalism from Jesus-oriented, God-embracing religions to a reason-based, atheistic, and humanist tradition. For others, this felt like a move from one dogma to another. And we have seen nudges back across the denomination. This had already begun during the time that I was being formed as a minister. Nudges away from identification with any one particular theology. And yes, we can argue that atheism is a theology, if we understand theology to be the consideration of and the determination on the existence of a divine being. Nudges toward understanding ourselves as not aligning doctrinally with any one particular vision of God or not God or the cosmos. These nudges worked to make space again for words like prayer, worship, God, words that carry sometimes painful connotations for some folks, but that also carry deep and abiding meaning for others. More than the re-inclusion of words, though, these moves away from perfect mapping onto 20th century humanism have meant that Unitarian Universalism has reaffirmed its commitment to being non-dogmatic, non-creedal, and to embracing a variety of theological positions. These moves toward what we might call a theological big tent have meant that UUism is no longer considered synonymous with humanism or atheism. But it has also meant that our driving concerns are no longer so perfectly mapped onto that classic American idolization of the individual, of progress, and of consumption. We've begun moves away from reason for reason's sake, away from prioritizing the individual will of each person, away from glorifying certain cultural norms. Still, always and ever, reason, science, our direct human experience will be considered foundational to our Unitarian Universalist way of viewing the world. But now, in this new century, we have come to understand some new things, including that the Goliath against which we arm ourselves with our smooth stones is not simply an external Goliath. Rather, the enemies of material greed, individualism, rigidity, lack of theological imagination, the enemies of complacency and comfort and oppression confront us both from without and from within. We've come to understand this truth through reason, science, and direct experience. It's the wisdom of those who came before that has helped us to be open to the ongoing revelation that has given us ever deeper knowledge. The world is not what it was 100 years ago or even 50. We are not who we were, though some things remain. I might, at the risk of being wildly impertinent, I might then posit a new set of smooth stones, drawing from the forebears who shaped us, but attempting to live into the truth of our lives and to prophecy for the future. The first, change. We have a deep understanding and appreciation for the reality and the gift that is the changing nature of our own lives and of the path of humanity. We believe that revelation is not sealed, nothing is finished. We will grow and renew and become, and the future is yet to be built. We have a lifelong right and responsibility to make meaning from our experiences using science and reason, and then to change in light of those experiences. The second, justice. We believe that building a world of justice is one of the central calls of our human lives. This work may look different for each of us, but to be able to say at the end of a life that we help to further good in this world is an end, a spiritual and theological end unto itself. This work requires our time and our talents, and justice ultimately means liberation for all through the elimination of material, moral, psychological, and physical oppression. The third, community. We freely associate with each other, not bound by anything other than our deep conviction that spiritual journeys, and more broadly, human living, are best undertaken in the company of others who support and challenge and deepen us. Community, not individualism, is a sacred context in which our beings are forged and our work is accomplished. We believe that we must put the collective and common good above our own desires. The fourth stone, love. We believe that undergirding all things is an impulse to life, to creation, to being. We can rightly call this impulse love, an animating force of goodness and compassion. This love must be made manifest in our human living, and not simply for those who have always known its force, but ever more widely, ever more broadly. The work of love is the calling into community of every single being from every corner of existence. And finally, hope. No matter what befalls us, what challenge comes, there is always promise, always possibility. Our human capacity to make change, to create justice, to build community, and to live with love means that we cannot cower in the face of overwhelming odds. We instead embrace the truth that history and our own hearts teach us, that hope, actively embraced and lived, can transform us and this world we share. Change, justice, community, love, and hope. I believe that's who we are at our core. This is who I believe we can be moving forward into the future. This is what we have to offer the world, not theological uniformity, but uniformity of vision, shared purpose, shared desire to bend the arc toward justice, to fill the world with love, to create a community of embrace that holds each and every one of us. We cannot ignore the past. We cannot give up the lessons, the permanent wisdom of those who came before. But also, we cannot stagnate. We must take stock of what is real all around us. And with our determination to grow, we must continue becoming. Who are we? That's today's question. Who are we? We are a people of faith, of passion, of purpose, of courage. We are a people who stay at the table, invite others in, and expand over and over our visions for the future. We are a people of change, of justice, of community, of hope, and of love. May we move into the future together, committed to our mutual becoming and to the transformation of the world. So may it be.